Press the recording. Thank you, Bobby. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jackie Luxinger. Thank you for joining us today. I have the pleasure of being the Colorado Informatics Chair this year and worked with a great committee this year. Thank you so much. Bobby Weber, who's Vice President of Portfolio Marketing for ClickSoft, Helmut Oering, CIO of Ascend Clinical, and our facilitator today, Richard Stainings. And I don't know if many of you have met Richard yet, but Richard truly is a globally renowned thought leader, author, public speaker, and advocate for improved cybersecurity really across the healthcare and life sciences industry. And so he has served on various healthcare security working groups. He's a board member of AEHIS and on the HIMSS International Privacy and Cybersecurity Committee, among others. We're so pleased to have his expertise with us today, and Richard is going to be our facilitator during our time today. Today, I'm going to ask Richard to take about 5 minutes or so to do an overview of the issues surrounding our topic today of security. Then he'll facilitate a discussion with our panelists, and then we'll leave about 15 minutes at the end for your questions. Please submit your questions via the chat at any time during the presentation. You'll see it at the bottom if you click chat on the bottom of your screen, and then the panel will open to the right, and you should be able to put your chat in, and we will monitor those. And so let me introduce our panelists so that we can get going. Scott Raymond, he is our Chief Information Officer for NetApp, and he is our current Colorado HIMSS President. So Scott, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Scott's got over 2 decades of healthcare experience ranging from hands-on clinical to strategic operations. And he's got this great unique ability to understand how healthcare leadership impacts patient care and vice versa. Scott, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you're at a conference. Thank you for dialing in.
Yeah, my pleasure, Jackie. Thanks.
Sure. I also have the pleasure of introducing Randall Fritsch. He's the CISO at Denver Health in Denver. A very passionate, effective, and strategically focused information security executive that's dedicated to ensuring value to the business from the information security function. He has a history of creating and maturing cost-effective information security programs around team controls and processes, and really is focused on reducing risk, increasing efficiency, decreasing costs, and alignment with strategic business objectives. Fritz, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day today to join us. Great. Thank you, Richard. We are looking forward to your time today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Jackie, and to Bobby and yourself for setting this up this week. I think we've got a very interesting topic, and hopefully we can get through quite a lot of the questions that we've put together for you. So today we're going to be talking about securing the healthcare of Internet of Things. And I wanted to spend 5 minutes, as Jackie said, just setting the stage here, talking about the issues so that it sets a bit of background for some of you who may not be quite so familiar with this aspect of healthcare security and the growing need to address some of these problems. So let me first start off to, in the immortal words of Sun Tzu, to say that, we live in very interesting times, whether, it's anonymous or whether it's cyber attacks coming from the Russian Federation. You couldn't have escaped the visibility of a constant stream of cyber attacks against the healthcare industry the world over. And obviously we in Colorado have not been immune from that. I'm not going to mention anyone by names, but it's getting to the point of who hasn't been hacked now or suffered a data breach versus who has. So, threats are many and constant, and they're growing threats. But in healthcare, we have to constantly play a game of defense to protect patient safety and health systems data. We need to know what we are defending first and foremost. And I think this is where a lot of the issues have arisen in this particular space, because it's been a bit of a gray area that falls between IT, between clinical engineering, between facilities. And it's obviously something that, despite some dotted line reporting mechanisms that have been put in place latterly, has still not been fully addressed. Essentially, we need to understand what connects to our healthcare networks, who manages it, and what risks it may pose in order to keep patients safe. Some countries, like the UK, for example, have mandated security in this area. the DSPT, the Data Security Protection Toolkit, has required that trusts understand the assets and that connect to the network and the risks that those assets actually provide. Now, why is that important? Well, I think COVID has changed the paradigm for healthcare delivery across the world, and obviously in Colorado as well. We are now more heavily reliant upon remote healthcare services, things like telehealth, telemedicine, but we're also more dependent on the IoT, the building management systems in our hospitals to manage the flow of patients through our hospital systems, to manage negative airflow rooms, and to contain pandemic disease spread within our clinical community. And that is causing an increased use of medical devices to monitor patients rather than nurses walking up to patient bedsides as they did prior to COVID. And it's also causing a change in a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of the technologies that we use in order to diagnose, monitor, manage, and treat patients. The difference is that nearly everything is connected today. We have seen a massive growth in the number of medical devices, an absolute explosion. And this growth is an exponential curve, essentially. Medical devices are growing at 20% per annum compound, right the way across all of the areas of healthcare. And so this is a problem that isn't going away. It's becoming a bigger, more significant problem. And it is impacting our ability to render patient care when these systems go down. Some of these connected devices are, might well be right in our faces, but we don't realize it. Things like elevators, for example. Elevators are critical to hospital workflows. You can't move a patient on a gurney from the emergency room to radiology for imaging, to the ER, to the OR, to post-operative recovery without the use of elevators. And all of these are now connected in just about all major urban hospital systems. And they're often managed by third-party vendors, many hundreds or even thousands of miles away. The same with our HVAC systems, our airflow systems within our within our hospital systems. They're absolutely critical for disease control. And we all saw at the beginning of COVID, the retrofitting of a lot of these systems so that we had more negative airflow rooms rather than one or two in the emergency room in order to deal with the influx of highly contagious patients. But who manages them and from where? The same thing with our HVAC systems. IoT security management's now critical, whether you manage healthcare IoT yourself or whether you outsource it to a third party. And I'm very privileged today to be joined by our my guests here today, Fritz and Scott, who are experts in the field here, and I wanted to press them for their ideas and their thoughts on how we address this problem. So firstly, if I may, let me kick things off with a question to Scott. We know that medical devices and healthcare IoT often present unmitigated risks to the HIT, the health IT network, and are a growing patient concern. But remediation's not easy. What are some of the issues about patching insecure devices?
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head. So a lot of these devices, and you can think big devices too, right? So it's not just IV pumps, but it's your CT scanners, it's your X-ray machines, it's your EKG machines. It's things that you wouldn't really consider or maybe think about that's IoT, right? Because you're thinking about refrigerators and some of the stuff that's more in the public space. But I think the biggest issue I had when I managed a big health system is how do you get the vendors to comply with patching? And you guys know this, right? I mean, some of them were running on XP long after the expiration, or some of them are running on Windows Server 2007 long after their date. So I think there's a couple of ways to attack it. Pressing the vendors to comply. A lot of them hide behind the FDA, right? And say that they can't change it because it's been certified this way. But if you look up the regulations, FDA actually has a second page to that says the providers have to keep the systems up to date, or the manufacturers have to keep the systems up to date. But in absence of that, I think network segmentation of those devices is the way to go, and monitoring, of course, of your network is key in those areas where these devices aren't compliant with the latest patches or latest operating systems.
Right. And I think you hit the nail on the head there, right? This is obviously a joint responsibility. You know, FDA pre and post market guidance has kind of outlined that in, you know, unmitigated levels of depth. But essentially, it comes down to how do we either put in compensating security controls like network segmentation, or how do we go about patching them? But you know, most hospitals have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of medical devices. So this is a very, very labor-intensive task if patches are available. Fritz, do we need some kind of set and forget approach here? Because plainly, you know, you're the CISO for a large health system here in Denver. I know you, like every other healthcare CISO, is constrained from a resource perspective. You can't go out and hire 100 people to go fix this problem. How do we deal with it?
Well, when you say set and forget, I think standardization. So I think really a baseline approach where every network device has to have the ability to change default password, the ability to update the operating system, the ability to run some sort of endpoint protection. And if not, what are the appropriate compensating controls that we can use? And that really needs to be much easier for healthcare organizations, because a lot of healthcare organizations don't have a large staff of security folks, a large budget for security controls, and more of the advanced, you know, network access controls and isolation type of security controls that we need. So really, I think what we need is to have the manufacturer's baseline across the security controls for any network devices. That way, when I get it as a security team, I know which classification it should fall into, and therefore I know exactly what compensating controls I might need on top of that. Without that, it's really kind of a mess. We really don't have a great inventory. As you said, hundreds of thousands of devices. Which ones are networked, which ones aren't? What operating systems do they run? You know, you got to have that information, or you have no idea how to secure them, or what they are, or where they're at. And those types of things are really important.
Yeah, I think you hit a good point. A good point there. I mean, plainly, you know, we need some kind of better understanding of what sits on our networks. Do we need an SBOM, a software bill of materials? I know there's a bill going through the House and the Senate right now around the security of medical devices, and one of the requirements there is for software bill of materials, so that CISOs like yourself can understand the risks and understand how to go about mitigating those risks.
Absolutely, that would be a good start, but I think we need something driven from a regulatory standpoint that requires these vendors to do kind of what I was describing. Because if you're a small hospital system, you have zero leverage with that medical device vendor, and so they're not really going to do a whole lot to help you out there. Especially when they have very, very large healthcare organizations as customers as well. And so if they're forced to provide that standardization and baseline for any customer, then I think that helps everybody become better.
Yeah, I would agree. Scott, in your experience, you know, running a hospital system as a associate CIO, were you successful in getting vendors to patch systems on a regular basis? To make you aware of new risks and vulnerabilities, 0 days perhaps, in devices that were on your network?
Yeah, I guess the best answer is I've had some success, right? And you know, during WannaCry, I'm sure Fritz remembers this, and you, Richard. During WannaCry, there was a big GI vendor that provides the scope and the software to do endoscopies and to do colonoscopies and those procedures. And they refused to patch their systems even post WannaCry. And the federal government actually had to get involved to get them to do it. we were part of a coalition of health systems that signed a letter to get that to happen. But I think Fritz has hit it on the head. You have limited ability if you're a small organization, with the one caveat, and I always tell this to folks, when you're renegotiating contracts or looking to renew support is the time that you push, right? Because you have the leverage at that point. And that strategy seems to be very successful. But, you know, there's still vendors that are hiding behind that FDA certification, right? And I think that's a problem, and maybe not a problem that we can fix unless the government gets involved, right?
Yeah. And a lot of them seem to be hiding behind the ambiguity or non-specific, non-prescriptive language that is used in the current regulations in pre-market guidance, for example.
Yeah, that's it exactly, Richard. Yeah.
So, you know, we've seen a fairly significant rise in the number of healthcare providers being hit with ransomware. You know, it seems that, you know, for the last 5 years, the healthcare press has been highlighting the fact that, you know, one hospital system, one provider, one dental practice is being hit after another with different cyber attacks. Is the industry being targeted by cyber criminals and criminal states? And that's an open question to either of you.
Yeah, I would say absolutely. And during COVID, I'm sure, Fritz, you've seen this, right? They targeted healthcare. I think the statistics I saw was a 66% increase or 100% increase in the number of attacks just in the first wave. And then that went up exponentially. So, you know, in the old days, they used to go after, you know, credit card information or go after, you know, PHI and then sell that information on the dark web. But these cyber criminals figured out that holding, locking, and keeping the data away from organizations and then charging a ransom for it was a much better way to get to the money. And so that's why you're seeing a predominance of ransomware. And the other statistic I read was there's 1 in 3 organizations will be hit with ransomware this year. And of those that get hit, 66% still pay the ransom, but most of those organizations that pay the ransom still don't get all their data back. So it is a problem that we all need to lean in and help each other, but I don't think it's going away anytime soon. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Fritz.
Yeah, I think the 60% increase was like the first month. And then I think in the next 6 months, it went up to about 600% increase in ransomware attacks against healthcare. And it was something that we were broadcasting to the organization and certainly leadership on a consistent basis because we were in the state of we are going to be hit. And I think that's the mindset that we need. Some of our leaders went to an EPIC meeting and a couple of CEOs that had been hit with ransomware came and spoke at that meeting. And they were describing being down for 28 to 30 days, completely down operationally, the phones, everything. And our leadership came back with a fire. And that was something that has caused us to not only from where we're at today, which is very good, to continue to step that up, to become a lot more resilient against ransomware. And we just held an exercise last month where we brought in all of the executives, all of the directors of service for all the different areas of the hospital. And we had a 2-hour meeting with them where we described a scenario where we were down for multiple days, multiple weeks. And we asked them to consider in their areas, how would you function? How would your business unit, your clinical area function? And the discussion was just fascinating because nobody thought about being down for not just a day or an hour or 4 hours, but 4 weeks, just completely downtime, paper charting. You know, some clinicians today, some of the younger ones have never charted on paper before, ever in their career. And so it was just a fantastic learning exercise. And really, I would recommend any healthcare organization get your executives and your directors of service for the clinical areas in a room and start discussing the real possibility of a ransomware attack that takes you down for multiple weeks, even a month. And what would you do in that scenario? And you'll just see the wheels start turning. And it's really going to turn into a conversation I expect to last for months, if not years, as we grapple with the realities of today a hospital trying to operate without phones, without computers, without internet connectivity, and just all the interconnectivities that you find when you start peeling back the onion.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point there. Time to recovery is obviously an area that, you know, boards typically don't really consider, right? They don't. They simply assume, well, we've got ransomware insurance. We can pay the money if we get hit with ransomware, and we'll have our systems back up and running in its business as normal again. And then we'll finally put in place some of the security controls that we probably should have done years ago to prevent, you know, a re-attack. But in actuality, you know, the cost of downtime, you know, can be measured, you know, in thousands of dollars per minute, right? If not more, certainly in major, you know, major hospital systems. But do hospitals, boards and CEOs really understand the risks of cyber attack threats? Do they, you know, do they understand the patient safety dynamic of what happens when HIT systems are down? As Scott said, you know, and, you know, a lot of our clinical staff, particularly the younger ones, not able to revert to paper very quickly because they haven't had those downtime, those BCP sessions, planning sessions or exercises where they're forced to you know, work without lights, without power, without IT systems, without medical devices everywhere. You know, is this something that they're beginning to get from your experience?
Well, I think that with all the attacks in the news in the past couple of years, they really have begun to do that. I don't think they innately kind of get that. And I think that's kind of the CISO's job, is to educate and communicate with them and make sure they are aware of their biggest risks, especially around ransomware and healthcare. We have a vendor that does an annual third-party security assessment on us against HIPAA conformance and against the NIST cybersecurity framework. And they tell us that the average healthcare conformance with HIPAA is 76%, which is better than it was 5 years ago. The average NIST cybersecurity framework conformance is about 49% against the controls under NIST. And that has not changed in 5 years, almost zero change in 5 years. And I think that really shows you that healthcare leadership and boards of healthcare organizations have not yet quite made the crest over to really understanding that cyber is your biggest risk, literally the biggest risk that you could have. And you've got to have the dedication and the commitment to investing in your security program, investing in cybersecurity insurance, and without really having anybody to translate for them other than the front page of Wall Street Journal, they really have no context, especially as it specifically relates to their healthcare organization. And I think that's what they need. I think that's what us as healthcare technical leaders have to be able to translate to them.
Yeah. Is compliance a driver still for healthcare? Or is it, you know, other potential costs of loss, like, you know, damages and restitution and all kinds of lawsuits that tend to go on for years? Do we need to update HIPAA, do you think? Does HIPAA need teeth?
Is that to me or Scott?
Either of you.
Well, I'll have to answer real fast, and then Scott, let's see if Scott has anything. I think that it is, HIPAA is fine because it is not prescriptive. HIPAA asks you to look at NIST in order to find out what you should be doing around the technical controls and the processes. So HIPAA, and there are lots of things in HIPAA that could be changed, but it basically tells you what you have to do, and then it says here, go look at NIST to find out technically what we're supposed to do. So I don't think from cybersecurity standpoint, the security rule, that the HIPAA really needs a lot of changes. I think that it is really more understanding the risk, understanding what it takes to secure a healthcare organization today with all the complexity, including healthcare IoT, and really having the right people, highly trained people, the right security controls, and also supplement that with some transfer of risk around cyber insurance.
Scott, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I would agree with you, Fritz. My last two organizations, we went down the road of doing a HIPAA NIST crosswalk, and then pressure testing that again with HITRUST to make sure that we're complying. Because Fritz is right, HIPAA is fine because it's a list of suggested strategies to secure your event or make sure you don't have an event. And then NIST gives the framework to the infrastructure teams to architect your infrastructure to make sure that it complies or is in that vein. And then HITRUST is a third party certification that you get that looks at how you are doing that, right? And I just think, to your point, I think a lot of organizations don't follow that, and they may follow HIPAA kind of to the letter of the law, but they're not following kind of best practices or standards-based way to look at cybersecurity, way to look at SecOps, look at the security operations of a health system. So I think there's some maturity that needs to happen for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Right. This one's for you, Fritz. In terms of the role of government, I mean, we've been talking around this from a regulatory perspective. We've also talked about, the existing FDA pre and post-market guidance. Should FDA be doing more here? I mean, they've been accused of sitting on the fence for, the past decade with a very cushy relationship with a lot of the vendors, the manufacturers of medical devices in the space. But, does the government need, the FDA or other bodies to have more power of enforcement over vendors and providers?
Well, absolutely. I think any government agency is going to have the same issue. You look at the defense agency and defense industry. That's actually kind of scary, right? But if you look at healthcare devices and the FDA regulated stuff, you're really relying on them to tell the healthcare, IoT medical device vendors what to do. And it's kind of a double-edged sword. I don't think that the guidance is specific enough, and I don't think it should be guidance. I think it should be a directive. And also I think that sometimes a vendor will, even our internal biomedical teams will tell us, hey, I see a vulnerability on this device. It's a biomed device. And the biomed team oftentimes will come back and say, well, FDA says we can't do anything about that. We're not allowed to touch it. We're not allowed to. And oftentimes that's not true. And it's either just lack of knowledge from the biomed team or incorrect information that they've been given. And so it's really a very complex thing that we have to address. And the problem is it's really complex around something that's so critical. We have network isolation in place around our biomed devices, around our PACS devices and so forth. But we have to be so careful with that, right? Because if we turn up a new rule and we take out a device in the middle of a surgery or something like that, that could be a life-threatening event. So I think we default to the more cautious side and we say, let's do less. And I think that the problem is we need to have the infrastructure and the people in place to say we can confidently assess what we have, build an inventory, classify those devices, determine where the gaps are, figure out the compensating controls to put in place, test those things and put them in place in a way that they minimize the impact to the healthcare clinical environment. And I think that we have a much better, we're never going to be so granular that we can say every single device, I know exactly what I can do with this one, exactly the patch levels. We almost have to put a shield around it, right? And that shield has to account for so many different types of things, talking different ports, protocols. And so it's really a hard job. And I think that it really takes dedication from the organization, investment from the organization. And I just think that we've been lax too long where they feel like biomed's good. We never have any problem with biomed. Why should we spend money? And I think that's where we've kind of dug our own grave there.
Well, that's an argument I've heard many times around cybersecurity, right?
Right.
It works, don't mess with it, right? Don't spend any more money on it, right? You don't need that multi-factor authentication realm. You know, you don't need these extra network access control capabilities of a new version. But I think it comes down to, in my opinion, it comes down to a higher level of automation, right? Automation to know what assets you've got on your network, how those assets communicate, the profile of the asset, so that you have confidence to implement, enclaving rules or microsegmentation rules, for example, for your compensating security controls. Scott, what are your thoughts around that? I mean, obviously, you've worked in a large health system. You're in a very large company right now. A lot of companies are moving towards AI-based tools, higher levels of automation, because let's face it, none of us can hire enough qualified, certified, or experienced IT or security practitioners.
Yeah, I think it goes, I mean, and this is going to be a broad statement. So I think it goes to data stewardship, right? Whether that's data that's within the four walls, that's data outside the four walls. So if you're not looking at your data management from that layer, it's very difficult to keep it in control, right? So I look at it, how are you storing your data? How are you managing your data? How are you sharing or moving your data? And how are you securing your data? And each scenario has specificity in that, right? So if you're using IoT devices, is the information that's coming across the wire, encrypted? Is the data on-prem encrypted at rest? Do you have the ability to do software encryption for the key applications that use the data? So I think, and then that goes all the way to, are you using the data for analytics and gaining insights, and how you manage that data from a data lake perspective or a data warehouse perspective. So I think I think Fritz hit it really well. You have to put in fundamental standards on how you manage your data across your enterprise, whether that's on-prem, in the cloud, in somebody's living room, or some IoT device that's connected to your critical applications that you need to keep running for patient care, right?
Or whether you outsource the management of that data and those systems to third-party vendors, which is what a lot of hospital systems are doing, particularly the smaller ones that we mentioned before, right? Managed detection response services have largely been outsourced for smaller hospitals now, because it doesn't make sense to run a 24/7 SOC on-prem and staff that appropriately. But what about the management? I want to come back to your earlier point about how we manage vendors in our environment. What about the third-party vendors that manage those third-party assets for us? How do we go about making them accountable? How do we gain visibility into the security that those vendors are implementing on our behalf to manage our environment? And how do we ensure that the fourth and fifth party vendors, their outsourcers, their suppliers, their vendors down the food chain are compliant with our risk posture?
Yeah, I think it goes back to my original point about at the time of the contract, you need to build in those controls. You need to build in that visibility. You should be able to have access to how are they managing the data. You definitely need to put BAAs in place because you need to have those third-party folks that are managing your data or managing your systems on the hook, and that drives them to compliance, right? And I think if you don't really look at how you're contracting with these third party, or like you said, Richard, like fourth party, fifth party, how you're contracting with them and what the language is in those contracts, I think you're going to be at a big deficit, right? So we made sure at my last organization that we went over those contracts with a fine tooth comb. Our SecOps team demanded BAAs to be put in place and our compliance teams. And so I think that's the angle to hit at it. Because once you let go of the control of your data, you still need your data, right? So if you're not managing the companies that are managing your data, then you're in big trouble, right?
Right. Yeah.
You know, I think third-party risk management is something that we could probably talk for 3 days about, but
I agree with you totally, Fritz.
the answer really is you can't, right? You really can't manage them other than from a legal standpoint. So the contract is your control, and that's really the only control you have. And we talked about HIPAA compliance and conformance with HIPAA. And the biggest reason why people get fined from HIPAA is because they don't do risk management well. And so all of these applications and SaaS solutions that seem to be 99% of the new solutions we bring in today, you know, we really can't do much. You know, we do sort of a canned questionnaire type of a situation, get them back. We ask them some deeper questions, deep dive, make sure we have the BAA, some sort of cybersecurity language in the contract that says you will maintain your downstream vendors' security, assess them. You know, you'll have pen tests or you'll have, you know, data loss protection. And that's really all you can do. You can't force them to do that. You can't go out there and say, you don't have it, and let's go put it in right now, or show me your firewall configs. You can't really do any of that. So you really have to trust, but put it in the contract and then reassess them over time to make sure that if anything changes, you're aware of that and that you're able to update the contract as you go. And that's really the only thing we can. I always talk about SolarWinds. You know, let's just say we were bringing in SolarWinds, we did a risk assessment on them. You know, how do we know that they weren't breached? You know, we sent them a 300 questionnaire and we got all the answers back and we were fully satisfied. They had a fantastic DevSec security program. You know, we felt very comfortable with them, confident with them, but they had a backdoor in their software. You know, who's going to know that? I mean, we can't look at their code. We're not going to be pen testing their code. And even if we did have any of that, we wouldn't have found this. So the risk assessment is really a lot of due diligence and a little bit of actual effective ability to secure your vendor. And I think that the due diligence is really the biggest part of that, because like I said, you can't really actually affect them in what they're doing.
Right. And I think the lines that, you know, the three of us probably grew up with when we entered the healthcare space, you know, of fortress healthcare, right, where all your applications resided in your data center, those days have long gone, right? We've now got a very much blurring of the lines with outsourcers, with third-party vendors, and with devices. Scott, I want to talk about wearables, medical wearables, right? There's been a huge growth in medical wearables over the last 5 years. Most of us walk around with an Apple Watch on our strapped to our arm that, you know, tells us how active we've been, or inactive in my case. You know, how many steps we've walked, how many calories we've consumed, you know, what our blood pressure is, all the rest of it, right? So, you know, and a lot of these systems are now reporting directly into EMRs. In Australia, My Health Record, the national EMR, now has an API that allows you to port your Fitbit, your Apple Watch, and anything else that you care to do into your medical record, so that your care team has access to that. This is expanding the threat surface, right? It's not just the medical devices inside the hospital we need to be worried about, but the Bluetooth connected ones that we take home with us, right? That may periodically connect and dump information into systems, data systems that are critical for clinical decision support and others. How do we manage the risks associated with privately purchased devices or devices that we send home with patients post-operative, for example, in order to monitor their post-operative recovery and to prevent them having to come back to our hospitals as a readmittance or as a as a constant outpatient clinic, which obviously costs money, time, and introduces risks, particularly in times of a pandemic. How should we deal with this? Where's the demarc, Scott?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to what I said on that data stewardship. So if you're setting up a program to have wearables send data back to the health system or back to the EHR, you need to make sure there's controls in place that that data transfer is encrypted. And then when that data lands, is it land on a device that can store that information securely? And I think if you look at certain devices, like we deployed Epic's MyChart, and we deployed Epic on a mobile device, so doctors can get to the access the record outside. So we enforced two things: MDM, so mobile device management. So you had to have certain controls on the phone before you could do that. The other thing, inside Epic itself, you manage kind of an elevated credential. So it has to go, the actual device number had to go in the Epic record to get to your, to be able to use that mobile device from a doctor's perspective. So there's ways to do it. I think, to your point, it's going to broaden, and it's up to the health systems how they manage that data. And then if you want to add, another complication. So with the advent of GDPR and CCPA, the health system as the source of the data has to comply with that. So if you have data going out, and there was that, I forget the name of the bill that went in to allow patients to have access to their medical record from a health system and put it on an app, a third-party app. So in that scenario, your data is leaving the organization, not coming into it. And then if that patient wanted to opt out and delete, how do you manage that? So it's going to become more complicated, but I think it goes back to that data stewardship. How are you managing, and are you putting standards in place, and are your compliance and SecOps teams involved in those decisions on how to give access? Because you saw during COVID, and Fritz, I'm sure you saw this, the demand to light up telemedicine, the demand to light up access to the healthcare systems outside of the organization were monumental, right? You had, like my health system, I sent home all 504 IT professionals to work at home during COVID. Did we have in place mechanisms to ensure that they could access the critical systems in the data center when they're remote, right? So do we have VPNs in place? Do we have elevated credentials to the systems that could shut down an organization? And I think we're going to get pressed for that more and more. And I think that working from home scenario is here to stay. So you have it both. You have it for your internal employees, you have it for your associated physicians, and you have it for the patients, right? And some of those controls will be different for each one of those scenarios.
Right. Yeah, interesting, and obviously growing problem. There's also a problem for, one of the other points that we mentioned earlier, which is around small providers, right? How do first responders and critical access facilities, which have very, very limited security staff and often limited IT staff, and limited expertise as a result of that, how are they expected to secure, their growing number of medical devices? Should this be outsourced? I looked in the back of an ambulance the other day, and there was a mass of devices in the ambulance compared to, the last time I rode in one of those things, which was probably 20 years ago. How do you manage all of this equipment? How are small, critical access facilities, how are they expected to keep up? Fred, someone's to you, sir.
Yeah, I'll tell you a quick story. I used to do security assessments for M&A, acquisitions of provider organizations for a very large healthcare organization. And, I found one doctor, a female physician, and her husband was the office manager. He was the IT guy. He was the security guy. He was the janitor. He was everything. And so it's really scary. They were using free cloud-based EMR and with no BAAs and things like that. So it's really kind of scary when you get into these really small providers. They really don't know what they're doing. They have no guidance. They don't have budget. They have an allocated budget for it. And so, yes, I think those organizations should outsource functions around IT and security. And that would be really important from not only building it securely, but also monitoring. So what kind of alerts are you generating and who's watching those? How often are they being watched? And what's the procedure if you find something that looks concerning, and who are you going to call? And those types of questions are really important. And so I think the perspective of the small healthcare organization really is kind of skewed, and they don't really know what they're doing, and then they're not sure who to call. And frankly, some of these small IT providers that you call, they're kind of jack of all trades. They're not really focused or specializing in cybersecurity. And so it's a challenge. It's a real challenge for these small organizations. I had another one that didn't run antivirus on anything. And they said, well, it's a waste of money and it just takes up processing power. And we just don't use it here. And that type of mindset is really the doctor. And the doctors are brilliant. And they think oftentimes that they understand IT and security as well as you do. And, bless their heart for that. But they often don't know, and they can get themselves in big trouble. So, yeah, I agree. Outsourcing is going to have to be the way they go with that.
Right. Yeah, I would tend to agree with you on that. We're coming up on the last 10 minutes of the session here today. So I think there's been a few questions coming. Jackie, Bobby, do we get some questions from the audience? And just a reminder that if you do have a question, please submit it via the Q&A tab on Zoom.
Yes, we do, Richard. Your first question is, as a member of the IT team at a healthcare company, what actions do you suggest are most effective to influence the FDA or other government agencies to implement some of the devices or directives suggested by the speaker?
Scott, do you want to take a first stab at that one, please?
Yeah, I'm losing internet. So could you can repeat that? I'm like in a big hallway.
As a member of the IT team at a healthcare company, what actions do you suggest are most effective to influence the FDA or other government agencies to implement some of the directives suggested by the speakers?
Yeah, I think collaboration between health systems, that example I gave you with Siemens was real. We collaborated as a group of health systems and got together and forced the issue. And I think that's key for a lot of things we do in IT. I think collaboration, even though the health systems compete with each other in a certain way, the IT teams should be collaborating, because the whole idea is to provide safe patient care and an infrastructure that supports that. And we can learn from each other, we can support each other, and we can collaborate with each other.
Good. Fred, any further thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that. We have this all the time. And, one way is to be in close contact with Colorado Healthcare Association, CHA. Vizient also has a lot of initiatives where you can be involved to be part of that process, where they sort of lobby the government, they lobby healthcare providers, they lobby medical device manufacturers. And that's a way to be involved in that. And then certainly having government relations. We have a government relations department, and all they do is work with state, local, and federal government agencies to try to influence and make sure that they understand that this is going to be detrimental for us. This would cause us to lose money. This could increase the risk of patient safety, or just, onerous. It's too onerous to try to put in place. And so many of the laws we've seen come out lately are just frankly too onerous. And I don't know, they're making laws, in a bubble somewhere. But sometimes a hospital to actually implement that is almost an impossibility. It's like the transparency law with regards to billing. On theory, that sounds fantastic. In practice, it's almost an impossibility to actually be able to do that.
Right. And of course, a blatant plug for HIMSS here. HIMSS has obviously a very powerful government lobby, certainly around health IT. So, feel free to go through HIMSS and use HIMSS's connections to speak with various authorities. Bobby, I think we had another question, right?
We do. Do you recommend prohibiting bring your own device to make sure you know what device is accessing the hospital network data?
Fritz, you want to kick us off with that one, please?
1000% yes. Prohibit them. Provide them with an alternative. So have a secure guest network, but nothing at all non-corp should ever go on your production network. And so that is the standard that we have. Now, that's not only a technical thing, but it's a political thing, right? You have to have built the relationships because people want to do that. Doctors want to do that. And you have to have major case and a risk-based case around why that's such a big deal and why you should never allow it. We have, or you have an alternative where you can have that data, but could have it containerized on a personal device. So we have applications that do have data that's sensitive on personal devices, but they're not ever connected to our network. They're more cloud-based and they're containerized on the application. So you can't pull the data down locally to your personal device. You can't send it across to your laptop at your house or print it. It's all containerized within the application. So those are the types of situations that we run into, but definitely never, ever allow BYOD.
Right. What about VDI, Fritz? Is that something you support? Yeah.
VDI is fantastic.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Screen scraping from a personal device, via the Citrix or whatever technology you're employing there, as long as the data doesn't leave your network. And I think that's kind of the line in the sand that most of us in this space tend to draw.
Yeah, absolutely. And frankly, with all the folks that move to remote, and now people that want to live anywhere and work remote, if you allow them to work remotely, why shouldn't they? Why can't they work on the other side of the country? But how are you going to secure that? And frankly, how are you going to do asset management and IT support for these devices if they're living on the other side of the country? And so VDI is really important. So they could use their personal device, they spin up a VM, or they could just use a WISE terminal and just load the session. And frankly, I don't care what happens to the WISE device. It's a couple $100, but all my security is now offloaded to on-prem behind my infrastructure. And I don't have to worry about it sitting out in the world somewhere. And so I think really, as we are all moving to more remote, data being distributed in places that we have no idea, I think really we're looking at moving back to a virtual environment where you only have a dumb terminal. It's almost like the mainframe's coming back, right? You just have a dumb terminal and everything you do is just a screenshot and a mouse click sent over to the mainframe or to the virtual environment.
Well, as long as no one asks me to revise my MVX or other mainframe skills, then we should be okay, because it's a long time since I've touched any of that stuff, as I'm sure it is for you, Fritz. But there we go. I was going to open it to Scott, but it looks like he's got network problems and dropped off. I know he's at a conference today, and we appreciate him joining remotely between sessions. I think we may have one more question. Is that right, Bobby?
We have another question. Actually, we have two. This is the next one. Given the shortage of cybersecurity professionals, what certifications or experience would you recommend for a healthcare administrator with operational but not cyber experience in devices interested in a career change to cybersecurity?
So this question is a hot potato. So there are two different paths. One is really more of the regulatory compliance side, audit, and really one is the technical side. So it depends on really what the person wants to do. If they want to go down the technical side, then they've got to dive into the technical side and starting with like a CompTIA A+, which is hardware, network plus, and then ultimately a security plus, and then you can go on from there. Having that deep knowledge around hardware, operating systems, databases, applications, the network itself, and then what are the security controls you need to wrap all that up in. I think that's a really good foundational way to not only identify your aptitude in what areas that you have, but definitely start building a technical foundation should you want to continue further. But also to help you decide which path you want to go. Do you really like the technical a lot? Do you have fun when you do that, basically? Or is it draining? And then, maybe you need to look at the audit. Is you have a little bit of this, you take that and you apply it to the audit side, and you can go through that and you can really effectively audit systems and programs while really not being all that technical and still do a fantastic job and have good value. So that, like I said, that's another question that we've been debating that one for years.
Yeah, there's many routes to cybersecurity and many different depths of specialization. So you no longer need to be a technical geek, as it was, when I started in cybersecurity, where I stayed up all night testing stuff and writing scripts and trying to break into my neighbor's Wi-Fi and everything else. But sorry, did I say that out loud? Okay, I have permission. But there are many routes there, and I think perhaps if you're new to cybersecurity and you want a broad depth, then do some of the cybersecurity boot camps that are out there. I mean, those of you who know me know that I teach at Denver University. We have a very effective boot camp that introduces students to the full gamut of cybersecurity, from policy and governance, risk and compliance, right the way through to technical penetration testing and cyber incident response skills. And then really where you want to focus. And there are obviously many academic programs out there that are going to give you a broad understanding, bachelor's, master's degrees in cybersecurity domains. But I think what we really need in healthcare is that we need to start training our HIMSS, our doctors, our nurses, our administrators, and most importantly, our senior administrators and management on cybersecurity concepts and cybersecurity risk management. Cybersecurity really should be everyone's concern in healthcare because patient lives depend on it, right? So we all need to know a little bit about it, enough to know not to do stupid things like click on links or open attachments, for example, which is the primary cause of cyber attacks against healthcare systems. Something like 89% of successful cyber attacks start with a phishing attempt, for example, right? So if you can avoid that initial dropper, that initial contact, then you've done your part to remediate that particular risk. So many options here, many ways to skin a cat. Hopefully there's no cat lovers on the session at this point.
I've been teaching cyber for 10 years and there's such a common misconception, even from an associate's degree, bachelor's, master's degree program, that I'm gonna get this bachelor's degree and then I'm gonna get a job making 200 grand a year as a pen tester right out the door. And I think that that's a failure of the educational system and in communicating and translating what that means for students today. And they go into this thinking that they're going to walk out making a couple $100 grand a year and having this really high level pen test job, and they're just not that's just not a reality. And certainly it could be a reality if they have the aptitude and the skills and they continue to build that before, during, and after their actual formal education. And you don't really need a bachelor's degree to be a really good pen tester. But I think that that's something that, because of all of the openings in the industry, because of all the interest in cyber, I think that a lot of healthcare, a lot of educational institutions are really pushing cyber, and they don't really understand it well enough to be able to give the right marketing message. And frankly, it wouldn't be as attractive to students if you didn't tell them that, they could get 200 grand a year when they walk out the door with their degree. So I think that's a big gap that we have. And I think as leaders, we have to continually educate all the folks coming up the right way to do things. What are the paths? What are the misconceptions and the myths that you're going to hear, and what is the reality?
Yeah, I would just reiterate, it's a combination of certification, qualification, and experience that makes a truly good cybersecurity professional. And you need a little of all three. So,
And I suspect you just answered the final question, which is, how can I apply for a position in the cybersecurity team?
Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't quite catch all of that, Bobby, but I think you said we weren't going to do the final question. Is that correct?
So I think you've answered the final question, which is, how can I apply for a position in the cybersecurity team?
Well, no one has ever accused Fritz or I of not being thorough anyway, so we're glad to have answered 2 in 1 on that respect.
Okay.
Thank
And that's all of our questions.
Thank you so much, Richard, Fritz, and Scott. Thank you. I knew who had to drop off, but thank you for a great discussion. I think you just gave us a lot of good information. I think, Fritz, your thinking around how do you build your bench, and Richard, how do you leverage those that may be retiring from existing jobs? How do they go to a next career? And cybersecurity would be an awesome career. So maybe more to come. Maybe that's our next one of our next topics. But thank you for joining us today. For those of you who would like to attend our HIMSS events, we do have a couple of upcoming events. We have the June 9th. We have a member and sponsor appreciation social, and then don't forget our golf tournament at Raccoon Creek on June 20th. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. We had some great attendees, great questions, and it is recorded, so we'll make this available for those who couldn't join us.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.